The door was the only warm thing left in the world. It stood at the center of a storm that had no interest in stopping. A rectangle of amber light bleeding through the gap at its bottom, impossibly alive against the white dark pressing in from every direction. A man stood outside it. His fist was raised to knock. His knuckles had gone past the stage of hurting and into something quieter, something that did not feel like his hands anymore. His name was Croft. 6 months before this night, he had stood on the porch of his store and laughed at the woman inside. He had called what she was building marsh trash. He had said it loudly, deliberately, so that everyone nearby could hear and understand that her work was not serious work. Her plan was not a serious plan. That she was not a woman whose efforts deserved anything other than the particular dismissal small communities reserve for people who refuse the established order of things. Now the established order had been replaced by wind and cold and the specific mathematics of survival, and Croft was standing outside a door he had no right to knock on, in a storm that did not care about rights. Inside, a child was singing. Not loudly, not for anyone, just the way children sing when they are tired and frightened and trying to give themselves something to hold on to. A melody with no particular shape, a low rise and fall that meant someone was present and continuing. 6 months before this night, this man had laughed at everything she built. Tonight, what she built was the only thing standing between him and the cold. The door opened, and she let him in. But that door, and everything it cost her to reach the moment of opening it, is a story that begins much earlier. It begins at the edge of a marsh, in the last days of a summer that had taken more than it gave, with a woman standing in the cattails and thinking about her mother's hands. Her name was Maren. She was 34 years old. She had $19 in a tin box beneath the floorboards. She had a daughter sleeping inside. She had walls that were not walls so much as intentions of walls. Cottonwood logs on 2 sides, salvaged boards on the third, and gaps wide enough that on still mornings she could see the pale strip of the eastern horizon through the north face of her own home. The wind did not care who she was. It came from the north the way it always came in that country. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a door thrown open onto nothing. It found the gaps in her coat. It found the space between her collar and her jaw. It moved through her the way cold moves through old wood, not around, but into. She'd been standing at the edge of the marsh for 10 minutes, looking at the cattails. They stood in long brown rows along the water's edge, their seed heads heavy and splitting, pale fiber drifting loose whenever the wind touched them. The fiber caught the light. It moved through the air like something exhaling, weightless, constant, and entirely free. She had walked past these plants 100 times since she arrived on the claim. She had never once considered touching them. She was considering them now. Her husband had left in the warm months, not in anger, not with the kind of departure that leaves a shape behind it, a door slamming, a voice rising. He had simply gone north with a freight outfit, word reaching her second hand through a man at the supply depot who seemed embarrassed to deliver it. Gone for work. Gone to settle a debt accumulating since before they arrived. Gone. And then silence. The kind that stretches across weeks until it becomes its own kind of answer. Until you stop waiting for the letter and start waiting for yourself to stop waiting. She had written to every depot and outpost she knew. She had asked every teamster who passed through whether they had seen a man matching his description moving north. Most of them shook their heads. Some of them wouldn't meet her eyes. By the time the first frost arrived, Maren had stopped expecting a letter. What she had not stopped doing was surviving. The claim was hers, legally, on paper, with her name written in ink she had pressed her own hand to. The law did not require a husband. It required 5 years of proof. Proof that the land was being worked, that improvements were being made, that someone was living on it and fighting for it through every season it offered. She had 2 years already behind her, 3 more ahead. Leaving meant losing all of it. The land, the labor, the only future she could imagine that did not require asking someone else for permission to exist. She was not going to leave. What she had not yet decided was how to stay. The cabin had been built quickly, the way first-season homestead cabins always were. Adequate in September, dangerous by November. The north wall was the worst of it. She could press her palm flat against the interior boards on a calm day and feel the air moving through. On a windy day, and most days were windy days in that country, the lamp flame on the table bent sideways, leaning away from something it sensed but could not name. She had a cord and a half of green wood stacked outside. Seasoned timber cost more than she had. A team to haul it would cost more still. The nearest man willing to sell hauling space wanted $14 for a single load, and $14 was a number she could not make work no matter how many times she turned the tin box over in her hands and counted what was inside it. Hartwell came on a Tuesday morning. He was 61 years old, weathered in the specific way of men who have spent many winters in hard country, not aged so much as clarified, reduced to what survives. He had lived in this settlement longer than most people could remember, and had buried a wife in his 3rd winter here, and an infant son in his 5th. He wore those losses without drama, as part of the landscape of his face. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the cabin with one hand trailing along the exterior, pressing his palm against the walls, testing them. He stopped at the north face, pressed both palms flat, held them there long enough to feel what was happening. Then he stepped inside without being invited and looked at the stove, the woodpile, the lamp on the table with its flame bending in the draft, and the loft where Sophie was still sleeping. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he is already calculating the failure of. "Half a cord of green wood," he said. "No proper chinking, no team to haul more." He moved toward the door. "This cabin will kill you before winter does." He left. The door didn't close properly behind him. Wind came through the gap at the bottom and bent the lamp flame horizontal. Maren stood in the center of the room and did not move. She could not leave. She had counted the reasons so many times they had stopped feeling like reasons and started feeling like the walls themselves. The claim, the debt, the 3 years still owed, the nowhere else to go, no family left to return to. Her parents were gone. Her sisters had their own land, their own trouble, their own winters to survive. There was no one waiting for her anywhere she could reach. The escape was closed. She had understood that for weeks. What she did not yet understand was the way through. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the quilt her mother had made. Thin now, the filling compressed from years of use, worn through in patches. But it still held warmth against her body in a way that had nothing to do with its weight. She remembered how her mother had dealt with drafts in their old storehouse, back when Maren was young enough to follow her around and watch. Not boards, not wood, just whatever soft material was available. Whatever could be packed into a gap to stop the air from moving through it. Whatever trapped air. She looked at the north wall. She looked at the lamp flame, still bending in the draft. She looked out the window toward the marsh. The cattails moved in the wind, their seed heads trailing silk into the frozen air, pale and constant, and endlessly, uselessly free. Maren stood up. She took the grain sickle from its hook by the door. Sophie stirred in the loft. "Mama, where are you going?" "To get what we need," Maren said. "Come help me." Before she stepped outside, she paused. She pressed her hand flat against the north wall, the cold moving through the boards and through her palm and into her chest. Wind, unobstructed. Air that belonged outside, wandering freely through everything she had been trying to hold together. Not for much longer. The walls held nothing yet, but she was about to teach them to remember. She opened the door and walked out into the cold, and the marsh waited, and the cattails bent toward her in the wind, as if they had always known she was coming. The first morning she went to the marsh, the cold was the kind that made breathing feel like deliberate work, not the sharp, clean cold of early autumn. This was something heavier. It pressed down on the open ground the way a hand presses on a wound, slow and deliberate, and without any interest in being moved. The cattails along the water's edge stood in ragged rows, their seed heads splitting open at the tips, pale fiber drifting loose whenever the wind touched them. Maren waded into her knees and began to cut. Sophie worked beside her, small hands wrapped in the only spare pair of wool stockings they had, pulling the cut stalks into piles on the frozen bank. She did not complain about the cold. She did not ask how long they would be out here. She was 8 years old, and she had already learned, in the particular way children learn things no one explicitly teaches them, that some mornings required silence instead of questions. They filled 2 grain sacks before the light changed. Then they dragged them home across the frozen ground, the sacks leaving dark trails in the frost, the stalks rustling with a sound like something whispering. Maren did not know yet if this would work. She knew she was going to try. The problem, as her father had taught her to approach problems, was not visible from the outside. You had to go to the cause, not the symptom. The cabin was cold, not because the stove was too small. The stove was adequate. The cabin was cold because the walls were breathing. Air moving freely through every gap and seam, carrying heat out as fast as the fire could produce it. You could feed that stove all winter and never win, because the cold was not waiting to be defeated by fire. It was waiting at the seams, patient and invisible, undoing everything the fire attempted the moment it was made. Wind first, fire second. That was the order. She pulled a board loose from the interior of the north wall and looked at what was behind it. A cavity of rough space between the inner face and the outer logs, wide enough in places to fit 4 fingers. Just empty air. Air that moved. She packed the first handful of cattail fluff into the cavity and pressed it tight with the wooden spoon handle. Then she held a candle near the surface. The flame stood straight. She moved 6 inches down the wall and packed another section. Flame still. The process was slower than she had hoped. The cavities behind the boards were irregular, wide in some places, narrow in others, interrupted by the rough protrusions of log ends, and the gaps where the original builder had tried to fill with mud that had long since cracked and fallen away. She had to feel for each air path with her fingers before she could seal it, pressing fluff into the space the way you press a cloth against a wound. Firm, steady, with attention to where the air was actually moving rather than where she assumed it would be. The clay she used for the mud mixture came from the creek bank, where the soil turned heavy and gray-blue a foot below the frost line. She had to dig for it with a stick, working the frozen surface loose before she could reach the workable material beneath. It was cold work, solitary work, the kind of work that leaves a person alone with whatever thoughts they have been avoiding. She dug the clay and thought about her mother. She mixed it with ash from the stove and thought about her father. She added chopped dry grass to the mixture to give it fiber and slow the cracking. And she thought about what she was trying to build here. Not just the walls, but the life inside them. The life she had refused to give up on even when the evidence for giving up was, by any objective standard, considerable. She was stubborn. She had always been stubborn. She had thought of it, growing up, as a liability, the quality that made her difficult to manage, that caused friction with people who expected compliance. She understood it differently now. Stubbornness was just belief that had not yet been proven. All she had to do was prove it. By mid-morning, her back ached from crouching. Her fingers were red and raw from pressing material into cold crevices. She had sealed perhaps a third of the north wall and felt, in an honest accounting, that she understood perhaps half of what she was doing. But the third she had sealed was not moving. She held the candle along each finished section, and the flame stood straight. Something was working. The principle was sound. She stood up and pressed her hand flat against the sealed section, then against the unsealed section a foot away. The difference was immediate and real. One side still, the other breathing cold air across her palm like an open window in another room. She moved back to the unsealed section and kept working. The problem, she understood now, was not the broad surface of the wall. The problem was the seams, the places where two pieces of wood met, where gaps had opened with the movement of seasons, where the cold traveled not through the material itself, but along its edges. You could pack every inch of the open cavity and still lose the battle if you left the seam paths open. The air was patient. It would find the one gap you had missed and move through it as readily as it moved through a gap the width of your hand. She was learning this with her fingers. There was no other way to learn it. She worked through the morning without stopping. By afternoon, 3 sections of the north wall had been sealed, and her hands had stopped being hands in the ordinary sense. They were tools now, extensions of what she was trying to accomplish, and they moved without instruction from her mind. Pack, press, test. Pack, press, test. The rhythm became something she inhabited rather than performed, and in that inhabiting, she discovered something she had not expected. The work was not miserable. It was not pleasant. Her knees ached from crouching. Her fingers were raw and cold, and the mud mixture dried faster than she could apply it in the unheated air near the wall cavity. But misery and difficulty are not the same thing, and she had confused them for too long. This was difficult. It was also, she realized somewhere in the 3rd hour, entirely within her power. She understood the problem. She had a material that addressed it. She had hands capable of the work. There were no missing pieces, no essential thing she lacked. She had what she needed, and what she needed was in her hands. And her hands knew what to do. This was a sensation she would return to many times in the years that followed. Not confidence exactly, not the particular swagger of someone who has never failed, but something quieter and more durable. The knowledge that when a problem is correctly understood and you have the means to address it, the work itself becomes the answer. You do not wait to be rescued. You do not hope for a better solution to arrive. You press the fluff into the seam and you hold it there and you wait for the mud to set, and then you move 6 inches to the left and you do it again. She worked through the morning without stopping, and by noon the north wall was half sealed and the lamp flame stood straight, and she was still there. It was Sophie who found the dog. She came back from fetching water from the creek with the pail only half full and her eyes very wide. Behind her, at a careful distance, walked a large animal that had once been a healthy dog and was now something in between. Ribs visible through a coat gone dull and matted, one ear torn at the tip from some old disagreement, paws cracked from cold. He moved carefully, with the deliberate step of an animal that had learned to expect less than it needed. He stopped at the cabin door and sat down. He did not whine or push through. He simply sat and looked at Maren with eyes that were still clear and still present in a way the rest of him no longer was, and waited to learn what she would decide about him. "He was behind Mr. Croft's store," Sophie said. "Just sitting there. I don't think anyone feeds him." Maren looked at the dog. She looked at the wood pile. She looked at the half-empty flour sack on the shelf. "One more mouth," she said, "is one more mouth. He can help carry things. He's very big. He could pull the sacks. He's barely standing. He'll be better when he eats." Maren looked at her daughter, then at the dog again. He had not moved. He was still waiting with the patience of an animal that had been disappointed many times and had decided, against all available evidence, to try once more. "Fine," she said, "but he earns his place." She named him Bear because of the way he walked, heavy and deliberate, slightly rolling, as if deciding with each step whether the ground deserved his weight. The name suited him in other ways too. He had the bear's way of existing fully in whatever space he occupied. No apology for his size, no nervousness about his presence, just a settled certainty that he was here, and that here was where he intended to remain. Within 2 days he had established a rotation: mornings by the stove, midday by the door where he could observe the yard, evenings in the loft with Sophie until she fell asleep, then back to the floor near the stove through the night. He had also, without being asked and without apparent deliberation, appointed himself to the task of monitoring the north wall. He would go and stand beside it several times a day, pressing his nose against the sealed surface and breathing in long, slow inhalations that apparently told him something. If the seal held, he would move on with the dignified approval of someone performing a satisfactory inspection. If something had shifted or cracked, he would sit down in front of the compromise section and remain there until Maren noticed and came to investigate. He was always right, every time. "He's quality control," Sophie announced one evening, watching Bear take his position in front of a section of wall that had developed a hairline crack in the mud surface. "He should get extra food." "He gets what everyone gets," Maren said, already reaching for her mud mixture. But she gave him slightly more cornbread that evening, and Bear accepted it with the dignity of someone who has earned what they receive. By nightfall he was lying in front of the stove with his chin on his paws, and Sophie was asleep with one hand resting on his back, and the cabin was, for the first time in many weeks, something that felt less like a problem to be solved, and more like a place where people lived. On the 3rd day of her work, Croft came. He walked across the open ground from his store with the confidence of a man who believed that what other people owned was always, in some way, his concern. He was tall and thin-faced, precise in everything he did, the kind of man who wore his coat buttoned all the way in any weather. He had extended credit to half the settlers in the area and collected on it with a thoroughness that made people careful around him. He stopped at the edge of her claim and looked at the 2 grain sacks she had left outside, still trailing pale fiber from their seams. "Mrs. Voss, what exactly are you hauling?" She was coming up from the marsh with a 3rd sack. She stopped. Her wrists were sore from cutting, her hands blistered, and she had been looking forward to an hour of work without conversation. "Cattails," she said. "I can see that." He looked at the sacks with the expression of someone examining something they find both puzzling and contemptible. "What for?" "Insulation." A pause, then the smile, arriving slowly. "You're going to insulate your cabin with marsh weeds." "Cattail down traps air. Trapped air holds heat. It works on the same principle as a quilt." A quilt. He said the word the way someone repeats a word they find ridiculous. "I've been in this territory long enough to see settlers try every desperate measure to get through a hard winter. I have never seen anyone try to pack their walls with bird nesting." From the store porch behind her, she heard laughter. 2 men, a woman with a basket who had paused on the path. Maren felt the heat rise in her face. She did not look away from Croft. "Have you seen anyone try it and fail?" "I've never seen anyone try it at all because it's foolishness." "Then you don't know whether it works." The smile faded. Something colder settled behind his eyes. "I know you owe me for flour and nails. I know your husband is gone. I know that if this scheme fails, you won't have time or resources to try something else." He straightened his coat. "Go to town, Mrs. Voss. Find somewhere warm. Come back in spring." "And my claim?" "Claims can be refiled." "Not by me, not if I abandon it." He shrugged. One shoulder, barely. "That," he said, "is your choice." He turned and walked back toward his store. The men on the porch followed. The woman with the basket looked at Maren once, quickly, then looked at the ground. Maren picked up her sack and kept walking. Birch arrived that evening. He was 53 years old, weathered in the specific way of men who live alone outdoors. Not age so much as reduced to what is structural, clarified down to the essential, the way wood left in the elements loses everything soft and keeps only what holds. He trapped along the low ground near the marsh, and had lived in a shelter at the edge of the tree line for longer than most people in the area could remember. He had no family in the settlement, no stake in anyone's opinion of anything, and he moved through the landscape as water moves, finding the available path and taking it without announcing the intention. He stood in the doorway and looked at the pile of cattail heads on her floor, the board she had pried loose, the cavity exposed behind it. "You're solving the right problem," he said. "Everyone thinks about fire. You're thinking about wind." He stepped inside and crouched by the north wall, pressing his fingers along the exposed gap. "A bigger fire doesn't help if the heat leaves through the walls as fast as you make it. Stop the wind first. Then the fire does what fire is supposed to do." "How do you know what I'm doing?" "Saw you in the marsh. Saw what you were cutting." He picked up a cattail head and turned it in his hands. "My grandmother used this where she grew up. Lined gaps in outbuildings. Stopped drafts." He set it down. "You're packing the cavities?" "Yes." "And sealing the inside after?" "Mud and ash. Chopped grass in the mix to keep it from cracking." "That'll work," he said. "But you're doing it wrong." Maren felt her jaw tighten. "Wrong how?" He moved to the corner where two walls met and pressed both hands against the joint. Air doesn't move through solid wood. It moves through seams, corners, the joint where the roof plate meets the wall, the gap under the door. He pointed to each one. Pack every inch of the cavity and still freeze if the seams stay open. She knew he was right before he finished saying it. "Show me," she said. He demonstrated at the corner seam, coarse material pressed deep into the cavity, fine fluff tamped tight at the seam itself, then the mud mixture over the interior surface to lock everything in place. He tested each section with a candle. Flame still, move on. Flame moving, pack tighter. Maren learned the rhythm within the first hour. Her hands were better suited to the fine work than his were. She packed while he directed, and by the time he left, the north wall's worst seams were closed, and the lamp flame on the table was standing straight for the first time she could remember. 2 days of weather left before it turns, he said from the doorway. Finish the west wall tomorrow. Why are you helping me? The question seemed to land on him oddly, the way a question lands when the answer appears self-evident. Because you're doing the work, he said. I'm just showing you how to do it better. He walked out into the dark. She listened to his footsteps fade on the frozen ground, then turned back to the wall. 3 days after Birch's visit, Croft returned. He came in the early morning, before Sophie was awake. Men with certain intentions came early. He stood inside the door and looked at the sealed walls, the gray mud and ash surface, the packed corners, the door frame stuffed and covered. He looked at all of it without speaking. Then he put his hand flat against the north wall and held it there. He lowered his hand. He looked at her. I extended you credit 2 months ago. Flour, nails, lamp oil. The account is overdue. I know it is. $14 with interest. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. I've been in contact with the county land office. A woman maintaining a homestead claim alone is required to demonstrate active improvement and continuous residence. If I were to raise a question about whether those conditions are being met, I am meeting them. You are doing your best. A pause. That is not the same thing in the eyes of the law. A different kind of cold entered the room, not through the walls, which were sealed, but through the understanding of what he was doing. He was not collecting a debt. He was making a calculation, the value of her claim against the desperation she would feel when he threatened it. What do you want? She said. I want you to be realistic, Mrs. Voss. If you cannot pay the debt and cannot maintain the claim to the standard required, then perhaps the best outcome. Get out! He looked at her. Get out of my house! He folded the paper and returned it to his coat. Until the new moon to settle the account. After that, I'll let the land office know my concerns. He looked around the cabin one last time. You've done clever work here, he said. It would be a shame to lose it. He left. The door closed behind him, and for the first time, it closed tight. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Maren sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pen. She had been turning it over all day. Sophie could go to Della's house in town for the winter. Della was practical and kind, and her house was warm. Sophie would be fed and safe and dry while Maren stayed on the claim alone and found some way to manage the debt, the threat, the winter. It was the sensible thing. She wrote the date at the top of the paper. Then she stopped. From the loft came the small sounds of a child sleeping. Breath, small shifts, the creak of boards under slight movement. Sophie had her father's way of sleeping, one arm thrown out to the side, as if reaching for something even in rest. Maren sat with the pen in her hand and the blank paper in front of her. Then Sophie spoke. Her voice was thick with sleep, not entirely conscious of the weight of what she was saying. "Are you going to send me away?" Maren looked up. Sophie was watching from the edge of the loft, chin resting on her arms, eyes half open. "Like Papa left?" she said. "Are you going to leave too?" Maren set the pen down. She did not pick it up again. She did not finish the letter. She sat at the table until the fire had burned low, then banked it carefully, then climbed up to the loft and lay down beside her daughter. Bear settled himself across the doorway below. The sealed walls held the warmth inside where it belonged. She was not going to send Sophie away. She was not going to leave. She was going to find another way. But what Maren did not know, could not have known, sitting there in the dark with her daughter's breath warm against her shoulder, was that Croft had been doing something else entirely. Something beyond the debt, beyond the claim, beyond the small cruelties of a man protecting his leverage. He had been receiving mail that was not meant for him. Letters addressed to Maren Voss, arriving through the postal service that operated out of his store. Letters written in a careful hand from the north by someone who had sent money along with them and expected both to arrive. That story was not ready to surface yet, but it was there, beneath everything, the way cold is beneath the ground even in summer, waiting for the right season to make itself known. Strand arrived on a Thursday with no announcement, just a knock and a set of thin wooden frames tucked under his arm that he had built in the barn behind his sister's place. He was quiet in the way that people who work with their hands are often quiet, not from shyness, but from attention. He noticed things. The direction a board was warping, the place where the mud had dried too thin and would crack before spring, the seam that looked sealed but wasn't. He set his frames against the wall and looked at what Maren had done to the north face. He ran one hand along the sealed surface, pressed gently at the corner, held a candle near the joint between the wall and the floor. "No air," he said. "Not on the north side. The west is still—" "I'll do the west." He picked up his frames. "These fit standard gaps. You don't pull boards to pack behind them. You slide the frame in, pack around it, seal the face. Faster, cleaner." She watched him demonstrate on a section of the west wall and saw immediately that he was right. What had taken her the better part of a day he completed in 2 hours, working with the precision of someone accustomed to doing intricate things under tight tolerances. Sophie watched from the corner with her arms folded, assessing, after a long while. "Do you have children?" Strand kept working. "No." "That's too bad." He glanced at her, then briefly at Maren, then back at his work. Maren discovered she had become very interested in the mud mixture she was preparing. Bear lifted his head and looked at Strand for a long moment. Then he put his chin back on his paws. This, apparently, was acceptable. Della came back on a Friday. She did not apologize. That was not Della's way. Instead, she arrived with a bucket of clay-rich earth from the creek bank, set it inside the door, and said, "Show me the corners, all of it." Maren showed her. They worked through the afternoon side by side, Della asking precise questions about the layering. How thick, how tight, what to do when the mud dried uneven. Her eldest daughter sat in the corner with Sophie, and the two of them practiced testing the lower wall sections with a candle, moving it slowly along the sealed surface. "She's quicker than her brothers," Della said, watching her daughter work. Always has been. Then she should learn it properly. Someone needs to teach the others. Della looked at Maren with an expression that was not quite apology, not quite admiration, but something in between. The look of a woman who has reconsidered something she thought was settled. "I told you the fluff would catch fire," Della said. "You were right to worry. I said the mice would get into it." "Also right. But you found ways around both." "I found ways around both," Maren agreed. Della nodded once, went back to work. By the time the light failed, they had sealed the worst wall of Della's own cabin, the north face, which had been leaking since the first autumn. Della pressed her palm against the finished surface and stood without speaking for a moment. "My house," she said finally, "has never felt like this in winter." "It will," Maren said. "Every winter from now on." What would you have done in her place? Consider the mathematics of it honestly. $19. 3 years still owed on the claim. A wood supply that would not last through January. A daughter to keep fed and warm. A community watching with varying degrees of sympathy and satisfaction to see when she would fail. Against all of this, 2 grain sacks of cattail fluff, a wooden spoon handle, a bucket of mud and ash. The memory of her mother's hands pressing soft material into gaps in an old storehouse wall years ago, in a country that was not this one. She could not have explained in that moment exactly why she believed this would work. She could articulate the principle. Air stops moving when it has nowhere to move to, and still air holds heat. But principle and practice are different territories, and she was operating on something less than certainty and more than hope. She was operating on the evidence of her own hands, section by section, flame test by flame test, the candle standing straight where it had bent before. That was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all she had. She could have left. She could have made a reasonable decision in a reasonable direction, and no one would have blamed her. And she would have survived the winter somewhere warmer and come back in spring to find her claim gone and started over from nothing. She did not leave. She sealed another wall instead. On the night the west wall was finished, Maren stood in the center of the cabin and held a candle at arm's length and turned slowly in a full circle. Every flame she passed, the lamp on the table, the taper on the shelf, the candle in her own hand, stood straight. Not a flicker, not a bend. The air inside the cabin was still in a way it had never been before, contained and quiet, and entirely her own. The temperature outside had dropped. She could feel it the way you feel a presence in a room before you see it. A heaviness, a pressure, a change in the quality of everything. The cold was gathering out there, building towards something. But inside, the walls held. Sophie appeared at the top of the loft ladder, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, are we poor?" Maren looked around the cabin, at the sealed walls, gray with mud and ash, at the neat stack of cattail bundles, at the small fire burning low and steady in the stove, doing exactly what a small fire was supposed to do in a properly sealed space. At Bear, lying across the warmest stretch of floor, his chest rising and falling slowly. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We are not poor." Sophie considered this. Mr. Croft, Maren said carefully, "knows the price of things. He doesn't always know their value." Sophie climbed back up to her bed. Maren put her hand against the north wall and felt nothing but stillness. No wind, no draft. Just solid, quiet, held warmth. The walls were holding, and so was she. But what none of them knew, in that small settlement going about its ordinary autumn business, was that the cold gathering itself in the north was not ordinary cold. It was something else entirely. Something that would come without warning and without mercy, and would make every decision Maren Voss had made in the past 2 months either the thing that killed her or the thing that saved everyone around her. The walls remembered what she had built into them. They were going to need to. The morning Della stopped coming, the sky was still clear. That was the cruelest part. The brightness of it, the hard blue, the way the frost on the ground glittered like something that meant well. It was the kind of morning that looked like a promise and had nothing to do with what was actually happening. Della came before sunrise. She knocked once, softly, and when Maren opened the door, she was standing with her arms folded against her chest and her eyes fixed on a point past Maren's shoulder. She was holding a package wrapped in cloth, food by the weight of it. She held it out without speaking. Maren took it. "Della, I can't come back." Her voice had gone flat in the way that voices go flat when the feeling behind them is too large to let through without damage. "My husband, he has debts. Croft has been... It isn't safe for us to be associated." She stopped, started again. "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry." "Della, look at me." But Della was already turning. She walked back across the frozen ground toward the track that led to town, and she did not look back. And Maren stood in the open doorway and watched her go until she disappeared around the curve of the hill. The package was heavy. Della had given them everything she could without her husband noticing. That was its own kind of apology. The kind that costs something even when it isn't enough. Bear pressed his nose against Maren's knee. She closed the door. Strand left 2 days after Della. He came to say goodbye in person, which told her something about the kind of man he was. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands and explained. His sister's debt had come due all at once, the way Croft's debts tended to, and there was work available further east that would pay enough to settle it if he left immediately and stayed through the cold months. "I'll come back before the real cold hits," he said. Maren looked at him. He looked at her. They both understood that what happened next was not entirely within either of their control. "Be careful," she said. He put his hat on. He looked at Sophie, who was pretending to be very busy with a piece of rope near the stove. He looked at Bear, who had positioned himself directly between Strand and the door with the serene obstruction of an animal who sees no reason anyone needs to leave. "Move, Bear," Maren said. Bear moved, slowly, with evident reluctance. Strand left. The cabin, which had been growing warmer and more inhabited with each passing week, felt suddenly very large for 2 people and a dog. That night, Maren lay awake and counted what she had. Sealed walls, a cord and a half of fuel, $11 and some coins in the tin box, a daughter, a dog, the knowledge of what she had built and why it worked, living in her hands now as clearly as her own heartbeat. She counted it all. It was enough. It had to be enough. She did not let herself think about what she had not counted. The man from the land office arrived on a gray afternoon 3 days after Strand's departure. He was young, with careful eyes and ink stains on his right hand that suggested he spent more time writing than most people in his position. He introduced himself as a legal representative from a neighboring office and asked if he might come inside. She let him in. He sat at the table and placed a folder of papers before him and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been asked to deliver information that is going to change something. "Mrs. Voss, are you aware that your husband sent correspondence to this address over the summer?" The room went very quiet. "No," she said, "I am not." 3 letters. And a money order. He opened the folder and pushed a document toward her. "We became aware of the situation through a complaint filed by a freight agent in the North who had helped your husband prepare the correspondence. He became concerned when your husband reported receiving no reply." Maren looked at the document. 3 dates, 3 letters, 1 money order, large enough that the number made her breath catch. "Where did they go?" she said. Some part of her already knew. "The postal service in this settlement operates through the general store." He paused. "Through Mr. Croft's establishment." The silence this time was different. Not the silence of a room. The silence of something finally becoming visible that had been present all along, just beneath the surface of everything she had tried to understand about the past months. The silence that had stretched across summer. The way it had eventually become its own kind of answer. The way Croft had smiled every time she walked past his store. "He kept them," she said. "We have reason to believe so, yes. Why? A claim this size, with improvements already made, and a holder appearing close to abandoning it, such a claim would be available at a very low price, or for acquisition through debt settlement." A pause. "There may be other explanations, but that is what the evidence suggests." Maren sat with her hands flat on the table. Her husband had not gone silent. He had written. He had sent money. He had been waiting for answers that never arrived, growing confused, growing worried, while she sat in a leaking cabin believing she had been left behind. 3 letters, 3 dates spread across summer, each one a moment when he had been present and trying, while she had been alone and slowly stopping herself from hoping. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the dark during the months when she believed she understood the silence. There was nothing left of that grief to spend here. What moved through her instead was something cooler and more precise, something with a shape to it. She looked through the wavy glass of the window toward the far end of the track, the painted sign above the store door. The porch where Croft had stood and smiled and called her cattails bird nesting while her husband's letters sat in a drawer behind him. She looked at that sign for a long moment. Then she looked back at the young man. "What do I need to do?" she said, "to make sure this claim cannot be touched?" He told her. She listened to every word. Bear knew first. He stopped eating on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. He simply walked past his bowl and went to stand at the north window and look out. His tail was low, not tucked, just still. All his usual morning movement was gone, replaced by a fixed attention directed at something neither Maren nor Sophie could perceive. Sophie crouched beside him. "Mama, Bear knows something. He might just be tired." "He's not tired. Look at his ears." Maren looked. Bear's ears were up and forward, rotated slightly north, the way an animal's ears orient when listening to a frequency too low for human detection. He stood at the window without moving. Then he began to pace, back and forth along the north wall, pausing at each window, then continuing. Maren went outside and looked at the sky. It was wrong in a way that was difficult to name. The hard blue of recent weeks had shifted into something yellow-gray, a color belonging to no ordinary weather, making the landscape look as though it were being lit from somewhere other than the sun. Her father had described a sky like this once, in a story from his own childhood. a winter people talked about for the rest of their lives. Sky that color, he had said, means the earth is about to breathe. And when the earth breathes hard, you want walls around you. She had never felt this predicted before the sky showed it. She had never known an animal to pace for hours in the direction a storm was coming from and be wrong. She had never felt the particular quality of wrongness in the air. Not the ordinary wrongness of an approaching front, but something deeper. Something that seemed to come from inside the ground itself. She brought Sophie inside. She brought Bear inside. She closed the cabin and checked every seal one final time, working through the interior systematically. Corners first, then seams, then the flat surfaces, then the joints at the top where the roof plate met the wall. She pressed fresh mud into a section of the west wall where she could feel a slight movement of air that had not been there the week before. She prepared the stove for a long run. She filled every pot and pail with water and brought them inside where they would stay liquid. She made Sophie a meal that used the last of the dried meat. They ate together at the small table with a lamp burning between them, and Sophie talked about the plants she had been identifying along the creek bank, and Maren listened and asked questions. And for a little while, the normal domestic texture of their life was present and intact. Then the wind dropped to nothing. That was the part she would not forget. Not the storm itself, but the silence just before it. The absolute, uncanny stillness that fell over everything in the hour before dark, when the last birds disappeared and the cattails stopped moving, and the air went so completely quiet that she could hear the lamp flame breathing. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes. It was the most frightening 20 minutes of the whole event. Bear sat in front of the door and did not move. Then the sound came. Maren went to the north wall and put her hand against it one last time. Tight, sealed, still. The walls were ready. She had made sure of that. The question was whether anything else would be. She had gone to every door that afternoon. She had said the same thing at each one, plainly, without embellishment, without the dramatic urgency that might have made people dismiss it as a performance. Something large was coming from the north. They needed to prepare now, tonight, before dark. She had said it calmly because she believed it calmly. The way you believe something that your body has already accepted as true, even when your mind is still arriving at the conclusion. Most of the doors had opened halfway and then stayed there. Hartwell had listened with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who has heard many things and been wrong fewer times than anyone around him, and has organized his face to reflect this history. He did not argue with her. He also did not move. The reverend at the small chapel had been kind about it. He had the particular kindness of someone who believes that what you're saying is not true, but does not want to cause you distress by saying so directly. He had offered to pray for settled weather. He had meant it as a gift. At the general store, Croft had been behind the counter when she came through the door, and something had moved across his face when he saw her. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition, but the expression of a man who has been told something is coming and has decided to file that information in a drawer he does not intend to open. He had turned back to his ledger while she was still talking, and then the porch, the young man with the loud voice who called after her as she walked back down the track. She heard the laughter that followed her, and she did not slow her pace, and she did not turn around. And that was one of the harder things she had done in a season full of hard things. To walk through someone's contempt without letting it change your direction or your speed. She understood something about that walk later, when she had had time to think about it. She had not gone to the settlement that afternoon because she expected to be believed. She had gone because it was the right thing to do, and because not doing it would have meant accepting a version of herself that she was not willing to accept. A woman who had knowledge and kept it private because she feared being laughed at. She had already been laughed at. The laughter had not killed her. It had not even slowed her down. So she had walked to every door and said what she knew and let them decide what to do with it. And then she had walked home and prepared her own walls, and her own stove, and her own water supply, and her own family for what was coming. That was all she could do. You offer what you have. You cannot make people receive it. Bear was sitting in front of the door when she got home, still and watchful, facing north. She put her hand against the north wall, tight, sealed, completely still. The walls were ready. She had made sure of that. The question was whether anything else would be. The storm did not announce itself. There was the yellow-gray sky, and then there was a sound like the world tearing along a seam it had been concealing, and then the wind arrived, not building, not growing, simply present at full force, as if it had been waiting just beyond the horizon for permission to exist. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the outside barrel, liquid an hour before, was solid before Maren could reach it. She went back inside and pulled the door shut against a wind that wanted to hold it open. And the latch clicked, and for a moment she stood with her back against the door and listened to what was happening on the other side of it. It was not a howl. She had expected a howl. That was the word people used. But this was something below that register. A sustained roar with a high component threaded through it that went in and out of audibility, like a voice almost but not quite forming words. It pressed against the cabin from every direction simultaneously. The walls shook. The stovepipe rattled. The lamp flame on the table bent horizontal and then steadied as the sealed cabin held its breath. Sophie was at the stove, her blanket around her shoulders. Bear was pressed against her side, his large body blocking the draft under the door. "How bad?" Sophie asked. "Bad," Maren said. "Stay away from the windows." Sophie nodded. She did not ask more questions. She had learned in the past months that some situations require action rather than understanding, and that her mother was the person who knew which was which. Birch was in the corner by the stove, where he had been since the previous evening when the cold had turned too sharp for the walk to his shelter. He had been coughing for a week, the catching, persistent cough of someone whose lungs had spent too many winters in damp. And Maren had told him to stay, and he had, for once, not argued. "Stove discipline," he said. "Small fire. Don't let yourself be frightened into burning through your fuel." "I know. Knowing and doing are different when you're frightened." "I'm not frightened," she said. He looked at her with his flat, pale eyes. "Good," he said. "Stay that way." The wind came in waves, peaks and falls and peaks again, each one testing a different section of wall, a different seam. Maren moved through the cabin with the candle, checking every surface she had sealed. The flame bent slightly near the door frame. She packed additional fluff into the lower gap, and the bending stopped. The north wall held. The west wall, strands backing frames, held without a tremor. The cold outside was a different matter. She could not seal against cold itself, only against the wind that carried it. And the cold pressed through the logs themselves, through the glass, through the earth beneath the floor. The temperature inside dropped degree by degree, slowly, like a tide going out, cold enough to see her breath, not cold enough to damage a healthy body. The fire kept it there, burning low and steady, spending its fuel slowly because the walls were not losing heat into the dark. She touched Sophie's forehead. Too warm. How do you feel? Fine. Then, a little cold. My head hurts. Maren said nothing that would frighten her. She added another blanket. She made warm water on the stove and had Sophie drink it slowly. She sat beside her and pulled her close and began to hum. The melody her own mother had hummed, the one with no particular words, just a low rise and fall that meant someone was present and not going anywhere. Bear settled along Sophie's other side. The child was bracketed in warmth. The storm pressed against the walls and found nowhere to enter. The knock came near midnight. Not a knock exactly. An impact. The sound of something landing against the door with weight behind it, as if the person on the other side had fallen into it rather than reached for it deliberately. Maren was at the door immediately. She opened it against the wind, bracing with her full body, and the cold hit her face like a flat hand. A boy was there, 12 years old, maybe 13. She recognized him, the son of a family 3 claims over, the same family that had stood on the store porch and laughed when she dragged her cattail sacks through town. He was standing in a drift that came up past his knees. His lips were the color of a winter sky. His hands hung at his sides because he had lost the ability to raise them. "Inside," she said. "Now!" She pulled him through the door by his collar and kicked it shut against the wind. The cold came in with him, and she leaned against the door until the latch caught. The boy, Willem, swayed and would have fallen if Maren had not been holding him. She lowered him to the floor near the stove, not too close, and stripped off his outer layers. "Frostnip," Birch said from his corner. He had not moved, but his eyes were tracking everything. Not frostbite. Fingers are white, not black. Warm him slowly. No direct heat. She wrapped the boy in the spare blanket and positioned him with his back to the north wall, the warmest wall in the room, the one that should have been the coldest, but was not, because of what she had built into it. "I got lost," Willem said. His voice was thick and slow. "The track. I couldn't see it." "You're inside now. Stay still." She cupped his hands in her own and breathed on them steadily. Not heat, just warmth. The way you bring back something you want to recover slowly, without shocking it. Sophie watched from her blanket nest on the floor. Bear pressed against her side. She watched her mother work with the particular attention of a child who was filing something away for later. The second knock came an hour after Willem's. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each one different in its quality. The first was desperate pounding. A father with 2 small children in his arms, one making a sound that was not quite crying and not quite breathing. His roof had gone, torn open along the ridge beam, and the cold had entered all at once. He stood in the doorway with his children and did not speak. He looked at her. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." The second was Hartwell. He walked under his own power and stopped just inside the door and looked at the sealed walls and the small fire and the temperature that was cold by comfortable standards, but miraculous by the standards of what was outside. And he set his jaw in a way that said he was not going to discuss what this meant tonight. "Come in," Maren said. "Get warm." The third was the young man from the store porch, the one whose voice had carried farthest when she walked through town with her cattail sacks. He could not speak when she opened the door. He was at the stage of cold where the body has begun making decisions about priority, shutting down peripheral systems to protect the central ones. She pulled him inside. "Come in. Get warm." The fourth knock was the one she had been bracing for without knowing it. She knew the sound of it, not the knock itself, the hesitation before it. The pause of a man who has never had to ask anyone for anything, and is discovering at the worst possible moment that he has no choice. She opened the door. Croft stood in the driving snow, and for the first time since she had known him, there was nothing calculating in his face. There was nothing at all except the cold, and what the cold had already done to him. His hands were at his sides. His store was 100 yards away, and might as well have been 100 miles. The window nearest the porch had blown in, and whatever warmth had been inside would have fled in minutes. He looked at her. Sophie was standing just behind Maren's left shoulder. Maren felt her daughter there, felt the small hand that hadn't quite reached for her coat, but was hovering near it, waiting. Bear stood between Maren and the door. His chest was low. His eyes were on Croft. The sound from his throat was not quite a growl, more of a sustained vibration, a frequency that communicated awareness without yet communicating decision. Maren looked at Croft. She thought about the letters, 3 of them, written in careful ink, sent north with the expectation that they would arrive. She thought about the months she had spent believing her husband's silence was his answer. She thought about the night she had almost written the letter sending Sophie away, and how close she had come to making a decision that could not have been unmade. She held all of it at once, the full weight of it, compressed, arriving in the space of a single breath. Then she looked at Sophie, who had understood more than an 8-year-old should have to understand, looked up at her mother. A pause. Then she gave the smallest nod. Just her chin, moving once. Maren put her hand on Bear's back. "Enough," she said quietly. The vibration slowed and stopped. She looked at Croft. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." No condition attached, no price named, no satisfaction taken. Just the words, plain and clear, the same words she had said to every person who had knocked on her door that night, because the knowledge of how to survive this cold was in her walls and in her hands and in everything she had learned from the people who came before her, and that knowledge did not belong to her alone. It had never belonged to her alone. Whatever Croft had done, he was here, in the cold, and she had the ability to open a door. She stepped back. He came inside. She closed the door against the wind. The latch caught, and the cabin held all of them. 17 people in a space built for 2. The cold screaming outside, and finding nowhere to enter. The walls remembered everything she had built into them. They held 17 people, 1 woman, 1 cabin built from marsh weeds and everything her mother left her. What would you have done in her place? The fire burned low and steady. The walls did not move. Outside, the storm continued its long, furious, finally futile argument with everything she had built. 17 people in a cabin built for 2. That was the arithmetic of it. And arithmetic, in a situation like this, was not a problem to be solved so much as a condition to be managed. Cold was a condition, hunger was a condition, fear was a condition. You did not eliminate these things. You worked within them. You found the order that made survival possible, and you imposed that order before panic could impose something else. Maren did not wait to be asked. She began moving before Croft had fully crossed the threshold, her mind already sorting the 17 bodies by need. Who was wet, who was cold to the core, who had children requiring warmth before anything else. She had been doing this kind of sorting in small ways for months. She had not known she was practicing for this until this moment, when it came naturally and without hesitation. "Children to the stove side," she said. "Not touching it. 3 feet back. Adults along the north wall. Anyone with white fingers or white ears, sit down now and don't move them." She did not raise her voice. There was something in the quality of her certainty that moved people the way a current moves water, not by force, but by direction. The family with the 2 small children settled against the north wall, the wall that should have been the coldest and was not. And the father pressed both children against it and felt the surface with his palm and said nothing, but his face changed in a way that said everything. "Warm water," she told Sophie, "from the back of the stove, not hot. Warm." Sophie moved with the efficiency of a child who had been watching her mother work for months and had absorbed more than she knew. She filled the tin cup, tested the temperature against her own wrist the way Maren had taught her, and brought it to the first person Maren pointed at. Bear stayed close to Sophie, not underfoot, close, moving through the crowded cabin with surprising care, finding the path that kept him near the girl without disturbing anyone else. He was, in his own way, also working. It was Sophie who reached the child who could not speak. She was 6 years old, the daughter of the family whose roof had failed, the family in which the father had laughed loudest on the store porch. The little girl had come in pressed against her father's chest and had not released her grip on his coat since. She sat against the north wall with her face turned in, and when anyone spoke near her, she flinched. Sophie did not speak near her. Sophie sat down about a foot away with Bear positioned between them and waited. Bear did what Bear had been doing all night. He existed. He breathed. His chest rose and fell with the slow rhythm of a large animal at ease. He put his chin on his paws and looked at nothing in particular and asked nothing of anyone. The little girl's grip on her father's coat loosened very slowly. Her face turned slightly, just enough to see the dog from the corner of her eye. Sophie, without looking at the girl, said, "He's warm. If you're cold, you can sit next to him. He doesn't mind." Silence. The storm outside. The low sounds of 17 people breathing. Then a small hand reached out and touched Bear's back, at the shoulder, with the tentative pressure of someone who was not sure they had permission. Bear did not move. He did not shift his breathing. He simply received the touch the way a safe thing receives something uncertain, without reaction, without requirement, just present. The little girl's hand remained on his back. Then, very quietly, in a voice that sounded like it had not been used in some time, "Is he scared too?" Sophie turned to look at her for the first time. "He was," she said. "Not anymore." The little girl looked at Bear. Then she moved, all at once, with the sudden decision of a child who has made up her mind, and pressed herself against his side, her face into his coat, and Bear exhaled slowly and remained exactly where he was. The girl's mother had one hand over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She made no sound. No one in the cabin spoke. People looked at the floor, or at the fire, or at nothing in particular. The storm pressed against the walls and found no way through. Hartwell watched Maren from his position against the west wall. When she came near him, he said, "The family on the East Ridge. They had twice the wood I do, and they're burning through everything. They have thinner walls." A pause. "You said that when you came to warn us." He was quiet for a moment. "I told you animals don't predict weather." "You did." "I was wrong." He said it the way a man says something he has been holding in his mouth for a while, testing it, deciding whether to release it. Not easily, but completely, without qualifying it or turning it into something more comfortable than it was. Maren looked at him. "Get some sleep if you can. We'll need everyone functional when the weather breaks." She moved on. She did not require more from him, because she understood that what Hartwell had just done was more difficult for him than the cold had been. Birch was watching her from his corner. He had been tracking her all night with the attention of someone cataloging something important. He had directed, twice, briefly, when she was managing the frost nip cases, and he knew something she had not yet reached for, and then retreated back into observation. He coughed into his closed hand. At intervals, he appeared to believe he was concealing. He was not concealing it. Maren caught his eye across the cabin. He looked back steadily. In his expression was something she had not seen there before. Not pride, but something adjacent. Recognition. The expression of someone watching a thing done correctly and understanding they no longer need to watch. She moved to sit near him when the most urgent cases had stabilized. The cabin had settled into its night rhythm. Low voices, the sounds of people trying to sleep on hard floors. "Temperatures held," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was rougher than usual. "North Wall is doing the heaviest lifting. Your daughter's side is the warmest zone in the room." "I noticed." "You noticed everything." He shifted against the wall. "Most people in a situation like this see only what's in front of them. You're tracking the whole room." "Someone has to." "Yes." He looked at the fire. "That's what I mean." He coughed again, longer. Maren looked at him directly. He did not look away or minimize it. "How long has the cough been like this?" she said. "Few days. Started before the storm. You were wet when you got here." "I've been wet before." "Birch." "I know." He said it simply, without drama. "I know what it is. I'm old enough to recognize what this kind of thing sounds like when it settles." He looked at her. "Don't make a face about it. I've had a good run." "Don't do that. I'm not being morbid. I'm being accurate." He leaned his head back against the sealed north wall. "You don't need me to tell you things anymore, Maren. That's what tonight is, if you want to understand it correctly." He closed his eyes. "Let me rest." She sat with him for a while without speaking. The storm peaked and fell and peaked again. The fire held. The walls held. In the deepest hours of the night, when the storm was at its absolute worst, Maren looked up from checking Willem's color and caught Croft's eyes across the cabin. He was not looking at her the way he usually did, with calculation, with the attention of a man adding up what you might be worth to him. He was looking at her with something closer to wonder. The specific wonder of a man who has built his life on the premise that things have a price, and people have a price, and knowledge has a price. Watching a woman give all of it away without condition in the middle of a night, he had done nothing to deserve surviving. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away and went back to checking Willem's fingers. The night was long, and the storm was long, and the work of keeping everyone alive was long, and she did not have time for Croft's reckoning with himself. That was his to do. She had her own. Outside, the wind found every weakness in every structure it could reach and made itself known through it. Inside this one particular cabin, 17 people breathed and stayed warm and did not die. Because a woman with $19 and a memory of her mother's hands had packed the walls with something everyone else had walked past. The walls held. They did not move, did not breathe, did not let the storm in. They held everything she had built into them, and they held it all night. Strand arrived in the early hours before dawn. He had been caught in a settlement a half-day east when the weather turned and had waited in a barn with his horse through the worst of it. The moment the wind dropped below the threshold of survivable, he had saddled up and come back. The knock on the door in those gray hours was firm and familiar. Maren opened it. He was covered in snow to the shoulders. His face was reddened by cold and wind in a way that would have concerned her if his eyes had not been so completely alert. He looked at her face, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the hours of continuous management written into the set of her shoulders. And then he looked past her, into the cabin. He took in what she had done. He did not speak immediately. He stood in the doorway looking at the sealed walls and the small, steady fire and the people sleeping in rows on her floor. The people who had laughed at her, who had refused to hear her, who had stood on store porches and called what she built trash. And he understood, in the way that someone who works with structure understands structure, what it had taken to make this room what it was. He stepped inside. He sat down beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he put his hand over hers. She looked at their hands, then at the north wall, then at Sophie, asleep at last against Bear's side, her face relaxed in the complete unconsciousness of a child who has held herself together through something large and finally been allowed to let it go. He had brought things with him, wrapped in oilcloth, strapped to the saddle, that he set quietly near the door without announcing them. Food, mostly. Some small tools. He had thought about what she might need while he was gone, in the same way that he thought about what a building needed before he began constructing it, practically, with attention to what the situation required. This was, Maren had come to understand, how he expressed most things. From the loft, with the silence of someone who had been awake the whole time and saw no reason to pretend otherwise, Sophie's voice came down, quiet and satisfied. "You came back." Strand looked up toward the loft. "I said I would." A pause, Sophie already drifting. "Good." Maren's hand turned slightly under his, not pulling away. They sat against the sealed north wall and looked at the room she had filled with warmth and people and the particular kind of order that comes from someone who understands that you cannot control the storm, only what you build before it arrives. Outside, the world was breaking open. Inside, the walls remembered everything she had built them to hold, and they held. The sky changed near dawn. The roaring quality of the wind became something lower, more intermittent. The gusts began to have spaces between them. The spaces grew. Maren sat by the stove in those final hours before light and watched Sophie sleep. The fever was still present. The child's forehead was still too warm, the warmth of a body working hard at something. She had kept Sophie's fluids up through the night, warm water in small amounts at frequent intervals. She had kept the blankets arranged around both Sophie and Bear, the dog's warmth supplementing the fire's work. She had done what she could do. She had been doing what she could do for months. And the thing she had understood in those months was that doing what you could do was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing. You did not need more than what was available. You needed to understand what was available and use it fully and trust that it was enough. The wind dropped to nothing just before the light came. The silence arrived so suddenly that several people woke and looked around in confusion, reaching for an alarm that turned out to be its absence. The roaring that had been constant for so many hours was simply gone, replaced by a quiet so complete it had weight. In the silence, Sophie sighed. Cool, not cold, just the ordinary cool of a sleeping child in a warm room. The fever had broken in the last hour before dawn, quietly and without announcement, as if it had always been planning to go and had simply been waiting for the right moment. Maren sat with her forehead against Sophie's for a long time. The relief that moved through her was too deep for the surface expression of it. It went somewhere else instead, into her hands, which trembled very slightly, and into her breathing, which changed rhythm without her deciding that it should. Bear opened one eye. He looked at Maren. He looked at Sophie. He closed his eye again. From the corner, Birch's voice came, rough and quiet. Her colors come back. Yes. Good. A pause. A cough, suppressed. Good. In the growing light, 17 people began to wake. They sat up and looked at the sealed walls and the dying fire and each other. And some of them looked at Maren, and most of them did not yet know what to say. That was all right. There would be time for words. The storm was over. The walls had held. Sophie was breathing easily, Bear's steady warmth against her back. What came next could wait until the light was full. The world outside was white and broken and very still. Maren opened the door when the light was full enough to see by, and stood in the doorway and looked at what the storm had left behind. The drifts had reshaped everything. The familiar track to town had disappeared beneath a smooth, unbroken surface, and the outbuildings of the nearest claims were visible only as suggestions of right angles beneath the white. The sky above was the particular blue that comes after a great violence has exhausted itself, clean and cold, and entirely indifferent to what had happened beneath it. She stood there for a long moment and breathed it in. Then she turned back inside and began the work of the morning. She fed the fire first. Then she heated water. Then she moved through the cabin assessing. The same quiet efficiency she had brought to it all night. Most of the 17 were intact. Cold, stiff, disoriented by the particular dislocation of having survived something large, but intact. Willem was sitting up against the north wall, eating the last of the cornbread with the healthy appetite of a 12-year-old who has had an adventure and emerged from the other side. He looked up when Maren crouched beside him to check his hands. My pa is going to want to know how you did this. I'll show him, she said. How to do it himself. He nodded as if this was the answer he had expected. Then he went back to his cornbread. They left one by one as the day warmed enough for movement. The father whose roof had failed, the man who had stood on the store porch and called out the day she dragged her cattail sacks through town, stopped at the door with his daughters bundled against him. He stood looking at the sealed north wall. He opened his mouth and closed it again. His youngest daughter looked up at Maren from inside the bundle of her father's coat. Is Bear staying? She asked. Bear lives here, Maren said. The girl nodded with great seriousness. Then they left, the father picking his way through the drifts without having found the words he had been looking for. Maren watched them go and did not need the words. She had seen his face when he pressed his hand against the north wall that morning. Some things do not require language. Hartwell was the last to leave. He spent the morning helping without being asked, steadying people as they stood on uncertain legs, carrying water pails, clearing snow from the door. At the door, when the cabin had mostly emptied, he stopped and reached into his coat. He produced something wrapped in cloth, a small iron tool forged by hand, a seam setter of the kind used to press material tight into the joints of woodwork. It was irregular in the way of handmade things. He had made it himself. That was visible in every line of it. "I should have made this for you in autumn," he said, "when I could see what you were doing. You told me the cabin would kill me. I told you the truth as I understood it at the time." He looked at the tool in her hand. "I understood less than I thought." He cleared his throat. "The old man on the eastern edge. He didn't come to you last night." The morning went still. "I know," Maren said. "I'm going to check on him. I'll come with you." He looked like he was going to argue. Then he looked at her face and did not. They found what they expected to find. The snow around the old man's doorstep was unbroken. No footprints going in, none going out. He had not left, had not come to find shelter, had not sent anyone. He had stayed where he was, alone, in a cabin with walls that breathed cold air as freely as the outdoors. He had been proud in the way of a man who has survived many hard things through his own resources and has come to mistake the pattern for a permanent guarantee. He had listened to Maren's warning and dismissed it because she was the marsh woman, and the cold was something he had managed before. He would not manage it again. Maren stood in the unbroken snow outside his door and looked at the landscape of the morning for a long time, the intact places and the broken places. The line between them, not drawn by luck or fate, but by what people had been willing to learn before the storm arrived. "This didn't have to happen," she said. "No," Hartwell said beside her. "It didn't." She went inside and did what needed to be done, and when she came out, she stood in the cold air without speaking for a long while. The grief of it was real and present. Not the grief of an enemy lost, but the grief of waste. A life that had ended earlier than it needed to because of a pride that refused the available knowledge. She did not try to make it smaller than it was. She let it be exactly as large as it was, and she carried it back with her across the snow. Croft came to the cabin on the second day, alone, in the mid-morning. He did not come to the door. He stood in the yard, visible from the window, waiting in the way of a man who is uncertain whether he has the right to knock. His hat was in his hands. Maren watched him from inside for a moment. Then she put on her coat and went out. He reached into his coat without preamble and produced an envelope. He held it out. She looked at it without taking it. 3 letters, he said. And the documentation of the money order. Everything. He paused. He sent enough to rebuild properly. More than enough. It's all in there. She took the envelope. She looked at it in her hands. The ordinary weight of paper that had been somewhere it was never meant to be, held by hands it was never meant to reach. "Why?" she said, not loudly. The heat she had felt in autumn had burned down to something cooler and more precise, the way a fire burns to coals, less visible, but not less real. "The claim was valuable," he said. "You appeared to be failing. A woman alone with a failing claim and improvements already made. It looked like a situation that would resolve itself if I waited. He stopped. I told myself I wasn't doing anything, just not acting, just waiting to see. While I sat in this cabin believing my husband had abandoned us. Yes, the word landed without cushioning. He did not try to put anything around it. My daughter asked me every night whether her father was coming back, Maren said. For months, she asked, and I had no answer, because the answer was in your store, in a drawer, and you had decided that my not having it was useful to you. He looked at the ground. He did not offer an explanation beyond what he had already given, because there was no explanation beyond it, only the fact of what he had done, and the fact of what it had cost her. She looked at him for a long moment. There were many things she could have said. She had rehearsed some of them in the dark hours after the land office man's visit, lying awake with the 3 letters folded in the tin box, and a specific kind of cold moving through her. Not the cold of the storm, not the cold of a poorly sealed wall, but the cold of understanding what had been done to her and why and by whom. She had thought of things to say that would have been precise and accurate and would have landed exactly where she aimed them. She did not say any of them, not because she had forgiven him. Forgiveness was a different kind of work, and she would decide later, in her own time, how much of it she was willing to do, and for whom. But because she had spent 6 months learning that the most important things were accomplished not through words, but through action, and there was no action available here that would give her back the months she had lost, or give Sophie back the nights she had spent asking a question that deserved an answer. There was only this, the envelope in her hands, the money her husband had sent, and the fact that Croft was standing in her yard in the aftermath of a storm that had left 17 people sleeping on her floor. People who were alive because of what she had built, not because of anything he had done. She had already won. She did not need to tell him that. Go, she said. He put his hat on. He turned and walked back up the cleared path toward the track that led to town, his coat straight, his walk unchanged in its surface precision. She watched him until he reached the curve of the hill and disappeared from sight. Then she went inside and sat at the table and opened the envelope. 3 letters. She read them in order, slowly, because they deserved to be read slowly. Her husband had written them with the care of a man who was not sure his words would land well and was trying to account for every possible misunderstanding. He explained where he was, why he had stayed longer than intended, what he had earned, what he was sending back, when he expected to return. The 3rd letter had the growing confusion of a man who had sent 2 previous letters and received no reply, and was beginning to worry about what the silence on her end meant. He had been trying. Through all the months she had spent believing he had chosen silence, he had been writing letters. Through all the nights she had lain awake rebuilding her understanding of her life without him in it, he had been in the north, confused by her silence, sending what he could. She sat with that for a long time. Whatever came next with her husband, that story was not finished, and it was not hers alone to write. But she was not the woman who had stood in this room in autumn with $19 in a tin box, and walls she could see daylight through. She was someone else now. She had made herself someone else, one sealed seam at a time, and nothing that came next could unmake that. She put the envelope in the tin box, beside the $11 and the coins. Then she stood up and went to find Sophie, because Sophie would want to know, and because some things are easier to carry when you do not carry them alone. Birch died 3 weeks after the storm in her cabin in the corner by the stove. He had not left after the storm broke. She had not asked him to, and he had not offered to go. And they had both understood, without discussing it, that his shelter at the tree line was somewhere he was not going to reach again under his own power. The cough that had been present before the storm settled deeper in the weeks following, moving from the surface of things to something more interior, and the distinction between getting better and getting quieter was one that Maren understood, even if she did not say it. He was awake on the last morning, clear, present, his eyes on the north wall with an expression that was not resignation but something more complete. The expression of a man who has finished something he set out to do and is looking at it from the far side. "Wind first," he said. "Fire second." "I know," she said. "You understand why now. Not the words, the reason behind the words." "Yes." He looked at her. "Then you don't need me to say it again." He settled slightly. "I've shown 3 people things worth knowing in my life. 2 of them forgot. You won't forget." "Birch, let me finish." He was quiet for a moment. "The best thing a teacher can do is make themselves unnecessary. That's what the past months have been." He closed his eyes. "That's enough. That's more than enough for one life." He died that night, quietly, in the way things die when they have done what they came to do and have nothing left to prove. Not suddenly, gradually, a dimming, the way a candle dims when there is no more wax to consume. The light goes, and the shape of the thing remains for a moment, and then that too is gone. Bear lay down beside him and did not move until morning. Maren sat through the night in her chair by the stove without sleeping, and she let the grief be what it was, full and real and without comfort, the kind of grief that does not ask to be managed, only witnessed. She had been given much by a man who had asked for very little, and she understood, sitting there in the dark, that the best way to honor that was not to make it smaller, but to feel its full weight and carry it forward into the work. She planted a willow at the edge of the marsh the following spring, in the place where he had walked every morning to check his traps. She did not mark it with a name. She knew what it was for. Spring came the way it always came in that country. Not gently, not with ceremony, but all at once, as if the earth had been saving itself for something. The marsh turned green quickly. The cattails put out new growth from the same roots as before, reaching toward the same sky. Maren stood at the edge of the water one morning and breathed it in, and understood, for the first time since winter, that she was hungry, that she wanted breakfast, that she wanted, improbably and entirely, to keep going. Della came back when the snow was pulling back from the edges of things. She came with a bucket of creek clay and no announcement, and she set the bucket inside the door and stood there in the way of a woman who has rehearsed something and then abandoned the rehearsal in favor of the truth. "I was a coward," she said. "Yes," Maren said. Della looked at her steadily, assessing whether the yes was an ending or a beginning. "You're not going to make this easier," she said. "Come learn the loft seam," Maren said. "It's the one most people miss. If you're going to teach the family taking over the old place in spring, you'll need to know it." Della picked up her bucket. She came inside. She set the clay near the north wall and rolled up her sleeves. "Show me," she said, and that was the end of it. Not forgotten, not collapsed into false comfort, but completed. The way things are completed between women who have known each other long enough to understand that the friendship is worth more than the single failure within it. They worked through the morning. Della's eldest daughter came at midday, and Maren showed her the corners and the loft seam and the way to test with a candle. And the girl was quick, the way Maren had always known she was quick, and she would teach others in turn. That was how it spread. Not through formal instruction, not through Maren standing at a center and dispensing knowledge outward, but through hands. One pair showing another pair, the knowledge moving through the settlement the way warmth moves through a properly sealed wall, finding its way into every space that needed it. Strand proposed in the marsh on a summer evening when the light was long and gold. They had been walking the edge of the water without any particular destination, which had become a habit of their evenings. Maren going to the marsh when she needed to think in the open air, and Strand appearing there after a while without either of them deciding that this was a thing they were doing. It had simply become something they did. He stopped walking. He looked at the water for a moment, then at her. "I'd like to keep building," he said, "with you, for a long time." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm better with wood than with words. I know that, but I want to say it plainly." "You said it plainly," she said. "Is that—" From behind the stand of cattails to their left came the sound of someone trying very hard not to rustle, followed by the sound of complete failure not to rustle, followed by Sophie stepping out from the reeds with the unhurried manner of a child who sees no reason to pretend she had not been there the entire time. Bear emerged behind her, tail moving in the slow, satisfied arc of an animal who has been patient for a long time and feels his patience has been rewarded. "She says yes," Sophie announced. "I already decided for her. Bear agrees." Strand looked at Maren. Maren looked at Strand with an expression that told him what her words were about to confirm. "She's not wrong," Maren said. He smiled. Not the careful, contained expression he wore when he was working, but something fuller and less managed. The smile of a man who has been allowed, finally, to stop being careful about something. They were married in late summer, in the cabin, with the windows open and the marsh smell moving through on the breeze, and the north wall still gray with its original mud and ash surface, and holding every bit of stillness she had packed into it the previous autumn. Hartwell came and stood at the back and did not make a speech, which was, Maren thought, the greatest gift he could have offered. Della stood as witness and cried in the way of a practical woman who is surprised by her own feeling and slightly irritated about it. Sophie stood very straight and formal throughout, and afterward went directly to find Bear and give him a complete accounting of the proceedings, apparently feeling he had earned the information. The years that followed were not simple. No years are simple, but they were hers. Genuinely and completely hers, built by her hands and shaped by her judgment and inhabited by the people she had chosen and the people who had chosen her, and that made them something that difficulty could not diminish. Sophie grew into someone remarkable. She had her mother's hands, capable and precise, oriented toward making rather than merely wanting, and a quality of attention that was entirely her own. She learned the name of every plant in the marsh. She learned their seasons and their uses and what they could do for the people who knew to look at them. She wrote it all down, eventually, in a book that other people read and copied and passed on, and that book would outlast the settlement itself, carried into futures that neither of them could have imagined from the edge of a winter marsh with 2 grain sacks and a pair of cold hands. She had always been curious in the manner of someone who cannot turn the curiosity off, who wants to know not just what something does, but what it is, how it came to be, and what else it connects to. She asked questions about every plant in the marsh. She asked questions about why cold moved through seams rather than flat surfaces, about why some materials held heat and others didn't. Maren answered what she could. The rest, she said, I don't know. Let's find out. This was, it turned out, exactly the right answer. Because it meant Sophie grew up understanding that not knowing something was the beginning of knowing it, not the end of the conversation. That curiosity was not a flaw to be corrected, but a direction to follow. The world would yield its answers if you asked carefully enough and watched closely enough, and were willing to be wrong a number of times on the way to being right. The years in which Sophie learned to be herself were years of gradual, sometimes effortful translation. The translation of a child who had experienced too much too early into a person who could carry that experience as strength rather than wound. She did not talk easily about the months before the storm, not the storm itself, but the months that preceded it. The watching her mother eat less and less, the understanding that they were in danger before she had words for danger, the weight of being the thing most worth protecting in a situation where the person protecting her was already carrying more than seemed possible. These were not things an 8-year-old had language for. She lived with them in the wordless way that children live with things they cannot explain, and they became part of the texture of how she moved through the world. What it gave her, eventually, was a kind of attention. She watched things. She watched them for longer than most people, and she looked for what they were actually doing rather than what she had been told they were doing. And she trusted what she saw with her own eyes and her own hands over what she had been told to expect. This was her mother's way of seeing, transferred to a child who had watched her mother survive a winter with it. She applied it to plants with particular devotion. The marsh was her primary subject for years, not just the cattails, which she returned to often, but everything that grew there. She learned which plants drew particular insects and what those insects indicated about the health of the water. She learned which plants changed behavior before a storm, which ones could be used for food in different seasons, which ones had properties she could not yet name, but could observe and record. She filled notebooks with careful illustrations labeled in her precise hand, with notes in the margins about conditions and behavior and what she had expected versus what she actually found. When she was old enough to pursue the subject more formally, she began trying to understand not just what things did, but why. Not just that the cattail fluff held heat, but the mechanism of it. Not just that certain plants indicated certain soil conditions, but what was actually happening between the plant and the earth. This led her to other books, other questions, other people who knew things she did not. She wrote letters to people she had never met, and some of them wrote back. And sometimes what they wrote back changed everything. She thought she understood, and she had to begin again. This did not frustrate her. Beginning again to Sophie was not failure. It was the next stage of the problem. Maren watched this unfold and said little. There was little to say. Sophie was finding her own way to the same understanding her mother had arrived at through different means. That the world yields its information to people who ask it questions carefully enough and are willing to hear the answers even when the answers are inconvenient. that the most useful thing you can know is often the thing everyone else has decided isn't worth knowing. The technique spread. Strand taught it to every family who asked, and many asked. The backing frames, the layered packing, the sealed seams, the candle test, the priority of corners over flat surfaces. Within several years, the approach had moved beyond the settlement where it had begun, carried by people who moved on to other places and built what they knew how to build. The first winter after the storm, 12 cabins had been sealed using Maren's technique. The following autumn, that number doubled. Not because anyone organized a teaching program or held meetings. People simply noticed that the sealed cabins were warmer and burned less fuel, and they asked how it was done, and they were shown, and they went home and did it. This was how knowledge had always moved through communities in difficult country, not through institutions or authority, but through the simple mechanics of proximity and need. You saw something that worked. You asked. They showed you. You did it. You became the person who could show the next person. More than 20 cabins in the surrounding area used what came to be called, quietly and without any formal designation, the Voss method. The fuel those cabins saved each winter was the difference, for some families, between barely surviving and having something left over. Between enduring and living. The work changed Maren too, in ways harder to name than the sealed walls or the learned technique. She had spent the early months of her time on the claim in the particular isolation of someone who has learned to manage alone and begun, without fully realizing it, to believe that managing alone is the only available mode. You develop a self-sufficiency that looks like strength from the outside and feels from the inside like something closer to armor. The accumulated reflex of not asking, not expecting, turning every need into a problem you solve by yourself. What the winter had done was show her that this was not the only available mode. That knowledge, which she had always possessed in theory, became something different when it was real and present. When Birch walked through her door and showed her the seams, when Strand appeared with backing frames, when Della came back with a bucket of clay, when Hartwell made a tool with his own hands and gave it to her without ceremony. Help arrived. It arrived in the forms that were available, which were not always the forms she would have chosen, and it arrived on its own schedule. But it arrived, and she had been present enough to receive it. She tried to carry that knowledge forward into the way she taught others, not the technique alone. What she tried to teach, and what was harder to teach, was the willingness to look at what was available rather than what was missing. The cattails had been there all along. She had walked past them 100 times. What changed was not the marsh. What changed was what she was willing to see. This was the thing she told people in the years of teaching that followed. Look at what's in front of you, not for what it is supposed to be or what you wish it were, but for what it actually is and what it might be good for. The answer to your problem is probably closer than you think. It is probably the thing you have been walking past without seeing. Croft rebuilt his store after the spring flooding with sealed walls. He did not thank Maren for the knowledge that made those walls work. He did not need to. The knowledge was not hers to be thanked for. It belonged to the marsh, to the hands that had passed it to her, to the cold that had made her find it. She wanted only what she had always wanted, to do her work and raise her daughter and teach what she knew to anyone willing to learn. Bear died on an autumn afternoon, years later, when the light lay long and golden across the marsh and the cattails were at their heaviest, their seed heads beginning to split along their seams. Pale fiber lifting into the air the way it had lifted on the first morning Maren had gone out to cut them. He lay down in his usual place, the warm stretch of floor along the north wall where the structure itself held heat, and his breathing became very slow and very quiet, and then, between one breath and the next, simply stopped. Sophie was sitting nearby, writing in her notebook, and she looked up when the quality of the silence changed, and she understood without needing to go closer, and she sat for a long moment with her pen still in her hand. Then she went to him and put her hand on his back and stayed there for a while and let it be what it was. She made the marker from a piece of oak she had been keeping, tight-grained and honest, the kind her father had taught her to choose. She worked it slowly, with the grain, carving the letters in a plain hand. He kept watch when no one else would. They buried him in the corner of the yard where the north wall met the west wall, the most sheltered corner, the place that stayed warmest in the cold months, the place where he had spent more of his life than anywhere else. The whole family stood around the place, and no one said anything about it being just a dog, because it was not just a dog, and everyone present understood that. And there are some griefs made smaller by words, and some that are made truer by silence. Maren grew old the way she had done everything, without drama, without complaint, with attention to the work of each day and the people who shared it with her. She outlived some of those people and was outlived by others, and she let each loss be what it was and carried it forward, and did not let it take more than it was owed. The settlement changed around her over the years. It grew larger in some ways and quieter in others. New families came, built, learned what the country required of them. The marsh remained constant, the cattails returning each year regardless of what the winter had done, growing back in the same thick rows, patient and reliable, and available to whoever was willing to see them. She had been willing to see them once in a desperate autumn with $19 and walls she could see daylight through. That willingness had made everything else possible. The cabin stood for a long time after the settlement had shifted around it, longer than most structures built in that season of the country's history. It stood because the walls held, not just through that first winter, but through the ones that followed, year after year, the cattail fluff and mud and ash plaster doing exactly what Maren had understood it would do. The knowledge outlasted the cabin and outlasted everyone who had been present when it was made. It moved through hands and was changed slightly by each pair that handled it, until it was no longer attributed to any particular person, but was simply the way things were done in that region in cold weather, which is exactly what Maren had wanted, though she had never said so in those terms. She had not been trying to leave a legacy. She had been trying to keep her daughter warm through a winter that wanted to kill them both. Everything else, the knowledge spreading, the walls standing, the book Sophie wrote, the method Strand taught, was the consequence of simply doing what needed to be done, with what was available, as well as it could be done. This is the only kind of legacy worth leaving, the kind you don't make on purpose, the kind that comes from doing the work. On a warm afternoon in the long decline of her life, she was sitting on the porch of the house that Strand had built when the cabin had proven too small. A real house with proper rooms and windows that fit their frames, and a porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a view of the marsh. when her granddaughter came and sat beside her. The child was 7 years old and had Sophie's way of watching things carefully before speaking about them. She sat for a while in the comfortable silence that exists between people who know each other well enough not to fill every moment with sound. Then, "Grandma, why do you always test the walls with a candle?" Maren looked at her hands in her lap. They were old hands now, marked thoroughly by the work they had done. The seams packed, the mud pressed, the fires banked through long, cold nights. The children held. She knew every line on them. She would not have traded one. "Feel this," she said. She took the child's small hand and placed it flat against the wall of the house. "What do you feel?" The child was still, attending carefully. "Nothing. Just the wall. No movement? No air?" "No. That means it's holding." Maren kept her own hand over the child's for a moment, the old hand covering the small one against the surface of the wall. "A man taught me to test walls that way. He smelled like wood smoke and cold water. He walked into my house without knocking, the first time he came, and looked at what I was doing and told me I was solving the right problem." She paused. "He taught me that wind comes before fire, that the most valuable things in this world are the ones everyone walks past without seeing." The child looked at the marsh. The cattails were full in the autumn light, their seed heads beginning to open, pale fiber drifting loose on the breeze. The same pale fiber that had once trailed from 2 grain sacks dragged through a laughing town by a woman who did not stop walking. "Will you teach me?" the child asked. "What he taught you?" "Yes," Maren said. "Everything I know." The light moved across the marsh the way light always moved in that country. Slowly, completely, touching everything it passed over with the same patient attention. The walls of the house held the warmth inside where it belonged. Bear's marker stood at the corner of the yard. The oak weathered now, but the letters still clear. The willow at the marsh's edge had grown tall in the years since she had planted it, and it moved in the late afternoon breeze with the particular grace of things that have put down deep roots. The grandmother placed her granddaughter's small hand against the wall and felt the stillness there, the stillness of air that has been stopped, of warmth that has been kept, of knowledge that has found the next pair of hands it needs in order to continue. She had $19. She had cattails and cold hands, and everything her mother left her. It was enough. It was more than enough. If you are facing your own storm right now, remember her. The walls remember. And so should we.